Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to our panel about GDPR 2 years later. GDPR has been in effect for about 2 years, and we've got a comment period coming up before the European Union, kind of looking at those effects. Those are due on the 29th, so in 2 days, and we're going to discuss what's been going on, looking at the Sorry, a little feedback there. So we're going to be talking about what's been going on, where GDPR is, where we think it's going, and the effects that that's having worldwide. Today, I have on our distinguished panel of experts, Andreas Hellmann, International Advocacy Manager at Americans for Tax Reform Foundation, Eline Chivot, Senior Policy Analyst at ITIF Center for Data Innovation, Alexiaa Jordan, Cyber and National Security Policy Analyst with Lincoln Network, Philip Thompson, Policy Analyst with the Property Rights Alliance, and Matthias Bauer, PhD Senior Economist at the European Center for International Political Economy. And I won't take up much more of the time. I'm going to kick it over to Eline. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the overview, some things that have been going on from your perspective there.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Katie, for having me today on this panel. It's a great idea to discuss this topic. I wanted to talk about the way in which we've been evaluating the consequences of the GDPR since its enactment in 2018 and some of the concerns that we may want to flag as the EU is moving forward with new legal frameworks. And maybe later on in the discussion, if time allows, I'm happy to chip in about what's currently on the radar of the EU in its upcoming review of the GDPR. And a consultation that the Commission has opened earlier this month. But first, there are some issues with the GDPR we initially pointed to and referred to in our work. The EU considers the GDPR as a golden standard for the rest of the world and creates a competitive advantage for companies. But what we've been saying, and we've published multiple articles and facts and figures about this, is that what the GDPR really needs is a reality check. We've seen evidence that the law has put companies at a disadvantage in a digital economy in which typically many countries are fiercely competing with developing technologies. And we've seen that evidence of the disadvantage for at least a couple of reasons. So first up, you have the high compliance costs that the GDPR has led to for companies, particularly tech startups and companies developing AI. And that's because they've been facing more restrictions than their foreign counterparts when it comes to their ability to process the needed data, typically needed to produce accurate and high-performing AI systems. So to give an example, in 2019, Bitkom, which is a large trade association in Germany, they did a survey to which 70% of respondents said that data protection requirements are the main obstacle to the development of new technologies, while in 2018, only 63% said so, and in 2017, 45% said so. That was before the GDPR was enacted. The limitation of to development technology can be explained by the restrictions that the GDPR imposes on how companies can collect, use, and process personal data. The GDPR was created before the AI boom and focused on big data, but its provisions inevitably apply to AI systems which process personal data and perform profiling and automated decision-making. And requirements like data minimization and explainability can be a tall order when it comes to AI systems, which typically, or at least many of them, still are more accurate with more data. And also some provisions are rather vague and ambiguous, for instance, whether pseudonymization alone is enough to achieve lawful processing. So while companies need scale and speed to function and compete, the GDPR really makes things slower and more expensive, and it distracts companies from investing resources in innovation, because certainly not all of them can afford all the lawyers and other specialists needed to comply. So that's the first point. The second problem is that the GDPR creates legal uncertainty because it's not consistently interpreted by national legislators. It's training the resources of data protection authorities, while these resources could be put to better uses, for instance, to provide more guidance to companies to help them comply, because that's also the role of DPAs. But several DPAs reported that they're overwhelmed, under-resourced, especially because companies are over-reporting potential breaches to make sure they're in the clear. And recent feedback from member states authorities from end of last year reveals that even the DPAs that have large budgets, like the Netherlands, mention, and I quote, a lack of clarity which could make businesses hesitant to try new solutions and to innovate. They mentioned the bureaucratic burden, and the German DPA wrote that businesses and government agencies have said they feel overwhelmed, that users are confused. And so there are many more inefficiencies that we're raising in our response to the Commission's consultation this month. So as a body of law and practice, GDPR remains enormously complicated and imperfect. And I'd like to briefly mention, refer to some issues that were exposed further by the COVID crisis. Because the COVID showed the existing requirements prevented the EU from making full use of data rapidly. AI researchers wanted to address the crisis by developing AI solutions, for instance, but that does require collecting, sharing, getting more access to data, and the GDPR can also limit that. And also the GDPR plans for exemptions in case of a pandemic, but it's up to member states to implement those differently, such as by deciding whether or not they can use questionnaires or take body temperatures. So that's still very patchy, and it's difficult for companies to figure out how these exceptions are being implemented. So it would be important to accommodate for needed flexibility to be able to use readily available data in case we face similar events in the future. Also COVID related, there's some irony in governments suddenly asking companies to relax their privacy rules on contact tracing, which goes against the EU's unofficial religion and years of rhetoric about privacy, but that's just a side note I wanted to bring up. And so the GDPR review and the EDPS data protection strategies will take into account the current crisis, and this could be an opportunity to clarify those provisions and obligations under exceptions, which I referred to. Last point, moving forward, there are concerns that the GDPR side effect will be replicated with the recent proposal and strategies of the EU concerning AI and data, and we will respond to those consultations as well. But so briefly, we find it problematic if the upcoming EU legal framework for AI is to impose and add similar GDPR-like impractical requirements like transparency and explainability in a way that will raise compliance costs and disincentivize investment, plus applying those no longer to just the AI systems running on personal data, but also beyond. And COVID has really shown a need and urgency for AI development. So there's a cost of not doing AI or with underperforming AI systems. The second strategy is the data strategy, which, if it is not carefully rolled out, could create regulatory schizophrenia, potentially, with more complexity because of the arbitrages that company could have to make between complying with a GDPR that restricts use and access and sharing of personal data, and B, a framework that actually aims to incentivize the sharing of industrial data, B2B, but that does mean having to protect the personal sensitive data that these data sets will inevitably include, if you think of healthcare data, for instance. To conclude, I just wanted to mention this, the EU really sees the GDPR and other future regulatory framework as instrumental in its push to gain digital sovereignty. Regulation is here being used as a defensive tool, but also offensive, as the EU likes to believe the rest of the world is copy-pasting the GDPR, and it is convinced that this experience should be replicated and extended, and the global market will follow through by globalizing the rules that Brussels is enacting. And this is concerning for the reasons I mentioned, but also because by going it alone, we could create more fragmentation, weaken our values, while we should and could work with our allies to compete with, China and its data advantage, and they're not kidding around. So the EU shouldn't be sidetracked by regulation of technology as a supposed competitive advantage, because if you cannot be the referee of the game if you don't know how to play it. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much for that summary there. That's very helpful and kind of getting us set up as to where things are going, where they've been, what those effects are that you all are looking at. And really, as you said, why is it that we need to have a reality check? Why is it that we need to look back at this? Next up, Andreas, can you kind of touch on some of the points or issues that you've been seeing with GDPR?
Yeah, thank you, Katie. So all the points from Eline were great. I don't want to repeat too much of it, but yes, if I look at certain member states like Germany, where 85% of the businesses are small and medium-sized businesses, so the backbone of the economy, and they really struggled with GDPR because they don't have policies in place that they could just rely on, or have like big departments in their small businesses that they could just defer like GDPR compliance to. So they had to develop new strategies and technologies and possibly hire people just to comply with this. And so that created like a big nightmare for them. It was a huge cost, and those restrictions were not helpful because this money could not be spent on business development or on innovation or other things that they would like to do, but rather than it went down the drain of basically a regulatory nightmare. I would like to talk for 1 minute about where GDPR fits into like this overall strategy from the European Union. So when we look at the past, we can see that the European Union always wanted to create their own digital space and wanted to be successful with their own EU digital-based companies. So they started with the massive amount of government subsidies in the beginning, and that really wasn't successful with the programs and companies they launched. Then GDPR came around the corner for what they said was privacy reasons, but was also a huge disadvantage for all foreign companies. And then they came around with the digital services tax, which was also a way of taxing American tech companies and creating a marketplace where they would be taxed more than others, and it would be a huge disadvantage. And now they're coming up with the digital strategy, which was announced, and it basically is about AI and data protection and others. But there are some parts in this proposal where you can just see that it's very plain and simple, very protectionist agenda in there. If you look at AI, for example, and if you look at the antitrust reforms in certain countries, you can also tell that this is just a policy proposal to create a so-called a safe space for European companies to be more successful and develop and kind of like push out foreign companies. So the last point I would like to make on GDPR is the fines are really important because it's a huge cost factor. And so the biggest fines, the 6 biggest fines so far were British Airways with 204.6 million euro, Marriott International Hotels with 110 million euros, Google paid 50 million euro, Austrian Post paid 18.5, and a German company Deutsche Wohnen paid 14.5, and the German Telekom paid 9.5 million in fines. But just to show you how crazy the impacts can also be on private citizens, a person in Germany who sent emails to several recipients, but included everyone else's email address, had to pay 2,500 euro in a fine because he violated GDPR. There was a fine issued to an Austrian citizen of 300 euro was issued because he unlawfully filmed other people with his dash cam when he was driving with his car, and 2,200 euro were issued to a person in Austria for recording his sidewalk and the outside of his house with a security camera. So you can see there's even like private citizens that didn't really do anything harmful, just wanted to protect themselves with the dash cam or their property with the security camera, and were fined as well. So clearly there's some problems with this sort of regulation, and it's definitely not helpful for innovation, and it's a huge burden on industry.
Great, thanks so much, Andreas. Next up, we have Philip Thompson, who's going to talk about some of the actual barriers to trade that GDPR has created. I'm going to give him a second there. You have a presentation. Yes, Philip?
Can
Okay.
everyone hear me and see my presentation?
Let's get that presentation loaded. Yes, there it is. And we can see and hear you.
All right, thanks. Sorry, I was on another webinar earlier. It's also World Intellectual Property Day, so I hope everyone can check out Property Rights Alliance, our Twitter handle, and share some messages on intellectual property.
Yes, you've been quite busy today.
Yeah, there's that. So I want to talk about GDPR as a trade barrier. So last year, we launched the International Trade Barrier Index. The purpose behind the index is we have a huge world trade organization and many trade agreements, and the whole purpose is to reduce trade barriers. But there wasn't something that was contextualizing which countries are using all types of different trade barriers. And so when we look at the public discourse on trade, there's a lot of distraction on stuff like surpluses or deficits, or what happens at these multilateral forum between what one leader says about another leader. So we thought we could get all the data together on trade barriers and put them in one place so we can focus the conversation on actually reducing what keeps people from trading between one another. So the index itself covers 81 countries, that's 83% of the world's population, 94% of world GDP, and covers 91% of traded goods and services. The index itself is a composite index. It gets data from the World Bank, from the United Nations, from the WTO. It's all equally weighted between the parts. The first three components are forms of trade barriers, that's non-measured tariffs and services restrictions. The last component, facilitation, so this is 1/4 of the index. It looks at the behind the border rights-based measures that need to be there that allow trade to happen. So that's property rights, logistics performance, our ports and highways working that can deliver goods, membership in regional trade agreements, which reduce barriers themselves and provide access to more markets. And the fourth component there is digital trade, and this comes from ECIPE's Digital Trade Restrictions Index. So I'm happy to see Matthias Bauer here. It's my first time, I think, seeing Matthias. He provided a case study on digital service taxes for the Trade Barrier Index. So what is counted as a digital trade barrier are these things that either keep data within a locality or they have compliance costs in transferring that data outside. So there's a couple different policy measures that provide a negative score on the index, and those are costly privacy restrictions, and so obviously GDPR falls into that category, but also regulations on providing backdoors for encrypted data, digital tariffs, digital service taxes, e-commerce taxes, bandwidth neutrality requirements, opaque rules on intermediate liability, and either opaque or absence of notice and takedown procedures. So I've seen some of the research from Eline Chivot. It's nice to see you on the costs of compliance with GDPR, and I heard what Andreas was talking about. There's a huge cost, especially for small businesses, on being able to comply, and there's also a risk of non-compliance. Firms can be charged up to 3% of their global revenue, so that keeps a lot of businesses have said that they're just not going to participate with European customers because they're concerned if they fall afoul of those costs. But in addition, specifically on trade, there's a lot of research from the OECD and other places that find that firms that are connected to digital platforms and digital infrastructure have a much higher propensity to trade. And that's great for especially digital advertisement, where a lot of data goes. Personally, I've been at home for a few weeks now, and I want to go out and explore more. So I've been looking for finding a new bike. I've been Googling, I've been searching on Amazon. I think it's terrific when I go onto Facebook or Instagram, I get these pop-up ads from these cool startups that have different frames of bikes and different ways of including batteries in bikes. And this is something that before the democratization of the internet, it would be impossible for these small startups to really find me. They'd have to put a mailer out or sponsor some sports events. And then you're catching a lot of eyes that are not really in the market for buying that product, but they're able to target me and they know this is something I've been looking for. So one of the big costs for GDPR is that firms have reported that their digital advertisements are not as effective anymore. And this is where firms, where on the trade barrier index, this is where regions rank. So overall, Western Europe, which is the EU plus Switzerland, is right behind Australia and New Zealand. And then the facilitation portion, this is the fourth component of the index. Western Europe is in the lead. It's mainly there because of the number of regional trade agreements that the EU enjoys. But when we look just at the digital portion, we see Western Europe falls behind a little bit. But when we look at the world, like individual country rankings on the digital component, most still, even with GDPR, can still be in the front. So the lower score means lower trade barriers. But there's these two at the back, so France and Germany. France is the only EU country in the bottom 10 of the index. And so it has GDPR plus other types of privacy and tax restrictions. I was surprised looking through the data that there's even, France has just a publishing tax on Amazon. So brick and mortar bookstores can still have a cheaper price than Amazon because they have to charge something for delivering. But I would just refer you to the ECIPE index to see more on that. Lastly, our suggestions for reforming GDPR is there's a lot of ambiguity, which causes some costs of compliance. So we think defining things like what is undue delay when firms have to delete data or report on how data is being used, how long is that? And one exception is if it takes disproportionate effort, and what does that mean? We also think that we should fines for, since there's such a large cost of 3% of global revenue, that fines should be more related to the amount of harm that's actually caused. And there should be more open regulations for use in machine learning and artificial intelligence, because this is where there's a new place in the economy for innovation. And we have a lot of small firms in the US that do great things there. And if Europe is really talking about creating a digital competitiveness, this is where there should be an opening. And this is some anecdotal stuff on EU firms. So 9 out of 10 most innovative companies are found in the US, 0 in the European Union. 11 of the 15 most valuable internet firms are found in the US, 0 in the European Union. And the top 10 US firms that are publicly traded are 50 years younger on average than the top EU firms. And so when we hear things about GDPR or new industrial strategy, those aren't things that would increase that competitiveness. Lastly, why we're especially concerned on digital trade barriers is that in the US and everywhere else, especially where we have the largest tariffs, including the European Union, are on these tariffs date back to like the 1800s when we're doing infant industry protection. One of the highest tariffs in the United States is still on shoes. It's 15%, even though it's definitely not like an infant industry anymore. It's been 200 years. But once one of these trade barriers goes into effect, you have this problem of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. So it's hard to organize coalitions after these things pass that will be dedicated to removing them. And so we're especially concerned about these new digital regulations. If I think we can agree we've had a lot of success with the internet so far and e-commerce, and I don't think we've seen enough harm that would justify some of these measures we've seen. And so thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that viewpoint with us, Philip. That's a different viewpoint that I don't think I've heard many folks discuss, those particular barriers that are created. We hear a lot about, what the difficulties are when it comes to digital traffic and those sorts of things, but what are the actual results when it comes down to trade between countries. So thank you so much for that. We really appreciate it. Next up, Matthias Bauer, going to talk with us a little bit about some of the other regulations in the EU as they relate to GDPR and what we might need to look out for there. Thanks.
Yeah, hello, good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm not a particular expert in GDPR, but I can indeed give you a few perspective about where GDPR sits in the EU's general regulatory strategy concerning the digitalization of the economy. I'd like to talk a bit about what Philip just mentioned, that it was close to impossible for small and medium-sized enterprises to advertise their products and services to a community that is far away from where they are actually headquartered. I just want to give you an example from the recent Corona crisis. I'm in my German office right now because we shut down the Brussels office, and I'm sharing my office with a designer who is in a completely different business compared to where I sit. But we set up a small shop on Facebook, selling T-shirts wearing the logo "Corona Hero," your man or your woman on the ground, and it turned out to be quite successful. Now the partners that we work together with, they even offer masks, and we can use this kind of sales channel to make people smile at the end of the day. And not only people around us in our community, but also far away, not only in Germany, but also in other European countries, which is a cool thing, I think. And it makes people smile, even in these circumstances, which are a bit dull. Anyway, I was asked to talk a bit about the interplay between GDPR and our regulations, particularly digital services tax. When we talk about GDPR, we can indeed talk about the trade barrier, as my predecessors already mentioned. It is increasing the cost to do business, not only for companies that operate exclusively in domestic markets in the EU, but particularly for companies that operate across borders. You should know that we in Europe, we are often talking about a single market, but the reality is that we do not really have a single market except for goods that can be traded relatively easily from one country to another, but trade in many goods, but also services in particular, is still restricted by different layers of regulations for consumer protection, taxes, VAT treatment of particular commodities, and so on and so forth. And this is also true for GDPR, because GDPR is actually wearing the name regulation, which means in theory that the law is applies equally across member states. But in this regulation, we have the features of a directive setting certain minimum standards, leaving discretion to governments who want to impose stricter regulations with regards to the obligations for businesses and also individuals who need to adhere to the data protection legislation. From that point of view, it is not only a barrier of trade in terms of increasing the costs of compliance for businesses, particularly when it comes to the administrative incentive costs of compliance, but it's also a cost that increases, a policy that increases the cost of trade between different jurisdictions, because governments across the EU are interpreting the law in different ways and enforcing it in different ways. Put into perspective with the digital services tax, the good thing of GDPR is that it is not discriminatory by design. It actually applies equally to businesses, irrespective of whether they are EU businesses or whether they are foreign businesses, for example, companies headquartered in the US but operating on European soil. Nevertheless, the digital services tax is also increasing the burden for companies, so it's also a barrier. It's also a cost component to companies, it may become a barrier to trade in the EU because we see a proliferation of unilateral measures. The digital services tax, contrary to GDPR, has not been implemented by the EU so far because some governments do not share the idea that we should have a digital services tax in the first place, and there are good reasons for it. First of all, the revenues are marginal after the deduction of administrative costs on the side of governments. They are literally zero, and the digital services tax is a tax that is borne by large companies, but paid by large companies, but effectively borne by small companies. And here it has an equivalent effect, more or less the same effect than GDPR. Both regulations particularly hit small companies. Large companies can relatively easily afford to manage supplementary regulations. For small businesses, micro businesses in particular, regulation is always costly, and in turn, this also means that regulation is always a subsidy to big business. And this goes, of course, beyond GDPR and beyond the digital services taxes. So SMEs are the biggest losers, but there are also a few beneficiaries. One group is politicians. I would call them economic populists, who are calling for stricter data protection regulation, even though they feel or even are aware that they will, in the end of the day, not improve data privacy and impose a very high burden on companies that have to deal with complex rules of regulations. And the second group of beneficiaries is law companies, lawyers for the digital services tax. It's tax advisors who advise companies with respect to complying to a very complex sets of regulations. And this is an aspect that has not been covered by experts so far, nor has it been covered by the media. And to conclude here, even though the GDPR is not discriminatory by design compared to digital services tax, it is an expression of EU policymakers of, to some extent, a hostility towards companies that increasingly digitalize. It is also, of course, a response to large digital companies, large tech companies, primarily from the United States, like Facebook and Alphabet or Google, who process and store and also trade a lot of data. What we should be aware of for the next, let's say, 1 or 2 years in the EU is the debate about technology sovereignty, which has some features of the debate on data privacy in general, GDPR, but also taxes on digital services. There is an increasing demand among policymakers, politicians, but also officials in the European Commission and the national ministries for tech sovereignty, digital sovereignty, or autonomy. Some policymakers are even calling for cutting Europe off from the international globalized tech space. Others are calling for exclusively European data spaces. And then there are strands of the debate where we read that companies who want to market services on the basis of artificial intelligence need to pass conformity tests in the EU, conformity assessments that are likely be conducted by European competitors who then have access to huge sets of data and processing algorithms and so on and so forth. So there is a very broad debate about what policymakers in Europe call technology sovereignty. It has many different aspects, and the friends of technology, and in particular the friends of free trade, should be very wary about the different strands of the discussions and where this is going to lead to at the end of the day. So yeah, I would leave it with that.
Great, thank you so much. And to round it out, we've got Alexiaa Jordan. She's joining us from Lincoln Network as the Policy Analyst for Cyber and National Security. I think that's a great lead in there, particularly with the mention of AI and uses there. Eline mentioned some of that as well. I think that'll be interesting for some of our discussion after kind of round this up as Alexiaa tells us sort of how is GDPR affecting the US, our privacy regulations, particularly California and nationally.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Katie. So the GDPR and CCPA are noble attempts at addressing the lack of comprehensive privacy law. And they were pushed after we all kind of felt that larger tech firms were mismanaging our data, right? You know, you guys remember that entire media blitz, you know, on tech companies. So I get it. But both the GDPR and the CCPA in the United States are going to have enormous costs and only manage half the problem. The NIST and different members of the IC have rightly outlined that managing cybersecurity risks and privacy risks have to be done hand in hand. Cybersecurity risks are situations where confidentiality is lost, right? Like I'm scared that my social security number is going to be out there and people have my name. Whereas privacy risks is when data processing goes wrong. And that's what can lead to confidentiality loss. So privacy regimes like the GDPR and CCPA add these very stringent rules on the data processing part of privacy law and sadly force small businesses to spend a lot of money on compliance that only still deals with half of the problem that we're actually worried about. So when I give critiques, I do like to put my solutions up front and then I'll get into why I think they're right. So first, I think that privacy laws should focus more on actual security in the US and also globally. And I don't think the US government should be the main voice on privacy and cyber protections, primarily because they are not tech smart themselves and they're still trying to modernize. And I think that privacy laws should be created in a collaborative effort between our very dynamic private sector and the public sector to both support deterrence for criminals and punishment for negligent firms. So I want to talk a little bit about the privacy regulations in the United States right now, right? So the US has 8 federal data protection laws. We have the Gramm-Leach-Bliley for financial institutions. We have HIPAA. We have the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the Communication Act, the Video Privacy Protection Act, FERPA for educational institutions, the Federal Security Law, and COPA, which deals with children's privacy online. Now, in addition to that, we have tort laws, contract laws, and data breach notification laws that are different in all 50 states of the United States, right? And all of this is complex. And the problem is that it's extremely complex to create uniformity with all of this. Now, in comes the CCPA, which grants California citizens the right to know, delete, opt out, and the right to non-discrimination. And it requires businesses that deal with California citizens to tell customers that they're about to take their data. It requires firms to hire privacy teams and create procedures for customers to exercise these rights. Firms have to disclose how much they value a person's data and how much they sell it for, and they have to keep a request of all these. They have to keep a list of all these requests. Right now, with all these new requirements, they sound great, but there are a fair amount of loopholes that a firm could get around to use these. For example, in section 1798.100 of the CCPA, it restricts organizations from selling your data to third parties without your consent. Sounds great. The problem is that it still leaves the door open for third parties to do other stuff with your data and not let you know about it because they're not selling it. Right? Similarly, with the GDPR, it requires consent to data processing, but firms can skip this if they just say, oh, well, you know, we need this information for us to conduct business. Now, the estimated economic cost of the CCPA is between 500 million and 16.5 billion. Okay, that's with a B. And over 92% of the firms that are going to be under both of these jurisdictions, as all of the former panelists have mentioned, are small to medium sized. So companies that have less than 20 employees are going to be spending at minimum $50,000 a year just to deal with compliance. And this is about the same per year with the GDPR. And all this money towards compliance does not actually help these companies do better to protect themselves, do better to protect us. The actual CCPA legislation, if you've read it, doesn't have the word cybersecurity in it, right? And the GDPR and CCPA told us that they would protect us better, but they're not helping these firms learn how to more safely process data and how to ensure confidentiality. And this, to me, is the problem with the privacy regimes. And all of this wave of concern that we have since privacy law is so popular now could be really an opportunity for us to both support up-and-coming cybersecurity software and use those good solutions so that these mom and pop shops can cheaply adhere to our privacy laws. Instead of dealing privacy rules, at home, a lot of these small firms are having to contract out just because they don't have the expertise. And again, this isn't helping, the safety that we're actually looking for as we're creating these laws. My second point, why I feel the US government shouldn't be the main voice and arbiter on this is primarily because we were very upset at all the big tech companies, right? And that's why all of our legislators, they said we needed to do something. And I empathize. I come from government. That's my background. But a lot of the major data breaches in the United States have come from federal agencies. Just last week, the USBA, the US Small Business Administration, was the victim of a data breach as people are trying to apply for COVID COVID support, right? A lot of loan information was taken. In 2006, the US Department of Veteran Affairs unfortunately had a laptop stolen, and the information of 26.5 million veterans were on it. The Office of Personnel Management that manages security clearances didn't understand that hackers were clandestinely in their servers and taking the fingerprints and background checks of 5.6 million US employees, right? Very, very important people, secret, things that are being displayed. So when it comes to privacy, government does not have the magic recipe. If government chose to put itself under the same type of compliance laws that it does for the private sector, just God knows how much money they would owe, right? So I am not pointing the finger and I'm not blaming legislators as if their compellingness to want to do something is wrong. But what I'm asking for is that legislators have a bit of regulatory humility because we all know that legislative change is slow. Now, that's completely the opposite with tech. So our approach to privacy legislation quite literally cannot be over cumbersome because by the time it gets written down on paper, the tech has evolved. Our definition of privacy laws have changed over the last 5 years, 3 years, right? What should be added and what should, consent, look like. And CCPA was such a rush job because elected officials wanted to do something. And I really do empathize with that. But I think another important thing to note here is that traditional political party lines on this topic are extremely blurred, right? So the key words for everyone right now and legislators as we're trying to mull through this together are flexibility and proportionality. The last point that I want to discuss is how I really do feel that privacy laws should be a collaborative effort between the public and private sector. The reason that the GDPR and CCPA doesn't do much to actually attain the online safety that we want is because these privacy regimes incorrectly, in my opinion, put the responsibility of user protection solely on the shoulders of businesses. Again, these are mostly small businesses, right? So I'm not letting negligent firms off the hook when they mishandle our privacy, but there is an imbalance between cyber threat actors' punishments and us blaming firms. And in dealing with privacy and cyber, bad guys will sometimes win. And humans will sometimes mess up and sometimes things will get stolen. And it's unfortunate. So instead of focusing our privacy laws around heavy punishments, I do believe that our privacy laws can be done in collaboration to help these small companies better keep our information safe and mitigate the risks when something bad happens. Right. So in conclusion, over the last 2 years, the CCPA and GDPR have created this overlapping maze of laws for the private sector to figure out, and it's very hard. And all of this piecemealing imposes way too high of costs on small firms and make the logistics a nightmare. Now, what is really cool about all of this is that it's created a new job market for compliance management and data privacy. People have to go get trained on this now and go to conferences and just now become smart on this topic, and that's great. And what I think would be useful is that if we chose to always think about privacy law in collaboration with cybersecurity, we could instead create a market where companies are competing to keep our actual institutions safe, where they are creating products that are helping enforce the privacy law that our legislators and our communities want, which I feel is more important than just the compliance aspect itself. And we are creating privacy legislation. There's always this tension, right? A lot of the panelists have already mentioned it. You can't have privacy and economic competition to the fullest. One has to concede. So whichever one we value more in the United States and the EU, we need to stick to it. I'm pretty sure you guys can empathize. I've learned a long time ago that indecision is a decision. So as a nation, we need to choose which side of this tension we're going to support and stick to it.
Great. Thanks so much for that that roundup there, Alexiaa. That was really helpful in putting that all in perspective, going back and forth and kind of what those issues are. We had a comment from one of our viewers saying that if you expand CCPA for all American businesses, it's $500 billion in initial costs. So an action by Congress to preempt CCPA will be a business funding package of $500 billion without any cost to taxpayers. And that's really interesting too, and kind of going through the situation we're in right now with COVID and looking at a lot of regulations that have been cut because those were in the way of healthcare or other types of operations moving smoothly. And we see those regulations, those barriers, and again, as Philip talked about, trade barriers, those are the kind of things where government can step out of the way. And in looking at more of a focus on security and where privacy really matters, that kind of harms-based approach that we've gone with in the US for so long, and that tension between the harms-based approach versus just the initial data collection is really a lot of what we're dealing with. And at this point, I'm just kind of going to unmute everyone so we can have an open discussion for the last few minutes here. Actually, you may need to unmute yourselves. And so one of the things that, I kind of wanted to ask Eline and Matthias, and maybe some of you who've also noticed in the beginning, there were a lot of issues with websites not being able to operate in Europe as a result of GDPR. Is that still the case? Are you still seeing that as an issue? Another thing you guys talked about was the impacts of GDPR on AI. Which I'd be interested in hearing you guys talk more about. And then also the who is information that kind of plays into the security and how that's affecting the operation of the internet, how that's affecting the ability to cut down on scams and things that are actually harmful to people on the internet. Eline, do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I'm not sure everyone hears everything well. There seems to be some sort of a sound problem.
I was hearing too. I didn't get the.
But I got part of it.
Again.
But I wanted to just in the interest of time.
Can you guys hear me? Okay.
I can hear you, Katie. Can you hear me? No.
Yeah, I hear you.
But Katie, I'm not sure Katie can hear me. But.
You're muted now. If you hold up like signs.
Okay, you guys back. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, now it's much better.
Okay, yeah, we had a little tech problem there.
Okay. So, yeah, thanks for giving me the word again. I just wanted to react to Alexiaa's wonderful and dynamic presentation, by the way. And it's true, you said that the law is, evolves less fast than the technology. And I think there was this Edelman, trust barometer that suggests that people actually don't trust policymakers to understand technology is enough to regulate them properly. And what we've been trying to do really is to regulate the technology rather than the conducts, like the misconducts. I also pointed to that in my presentation, but I was happy to hear some key aspects of GDPR in everyone's presentation about the fragmentation of approaches, the fact that all of that does lead companies to focus on compliance instead of building systems that really protect users. And why the focus should be on raising investments and really giving companies a space to scale, and also reviewing the existing legislations that already apply. I think that was also raised. One thing that is maybe something that is getting a reality check now is how much can Europe achieve, especially now with the new situation of, we're going to need money. And we want to build all these new technologies by Europeans for Europeans in Europe. We want to have our own cloud. We want to have our own data. But I don't know. I don't see companies all of a sudden changing from their trusted providers, for instance, in cloud, which are often American companies, to newly created European providers that may not be yet there in terms of technical expertise, etc. Katie, I think your question, you wanted me to react again, explain further how the GDPR may be a roadblock to developing AI systems. It has to do with some of the requirements that are in the law. So explainability, transparency, data minimization. For some AI systems, it is difficult to explain how an AI system has come up with a particular decision. Explaining the logic also is difficult, and when you have the consent problem. So according to the GDPR, you have to provide information with notices for users, in plain words, with easy terms, etc. I mean, there's actually a sentence that describes that. It is difficult to provide a clear and in plain terms explanation about an algorithm to your layman. So this is typically how it concretely could affect the development of accurate system. And now I think Matthias mentioned the new plans of the EU and the ex-ante conformity assessment. I mean, that is also an example of how do we manage that. We don't have the expertise for those independent auditors to review algorithms in Europe, not yet, not in all member states. And if you look at how DPAs are, lack resources and are not capable of implementing the current law already, what's going to happen when they have to do sort of the same type of work with an AI legal framework that requires the same sort of role and expertise. So hopefully that answers some of the follow-up questions that you asked me.
Yeah, could I come here again? Regarding the deterrent effect on businesses to operate or to start operations in Europe, there is indeed a lot of anecdotal evidence. Unfortunately, we do not see a lot of systematic evidence that businesses are experiencing real difficulties in doing business in the EU. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence. Common sense tells us that this regulation is difficult to comply with. When you talk to people or business representatives, most of them do really not know how to comply in order to satisfy the authorities, data protection offices in the national member states. So there are many unknowns. We also see statistics pointing to less investment in some sectors that are related to technology-enabled business models in the EU. We also see we see it particularly in venture capital, even though there are many determinants impacting on investors' decisions to put money to European companies. We should not forget that a general disadvantage of companies operating in the EU is that we do not have a single market, so you cannot really scale your business from one member state capital to another, compared to the situation that you face in the US or even in China, where the regulatory playing field is much more leveled. Yeah, in the EU, we also hear a lot about European values, but as Eline said, I think policymakers need to make sure that a regulatory level playing field that allows businesses to scale at a relatively low cost is the most important thing to focus on. And that said, I think both policymakers in the US and the EU should not act in isolationist ways. I think the EU and the US cooperated for decades. I think there is still a relatively common set of key values. Values is a different animal. Is a difficult animal to talk about. We all share different values, but I think there are certain values that are still to a very large extent shared between governments across the EU, but also EU governments and the US with regard to state interventionism in the economy, but also human rights. And I think the US and the EU have much to gain if some of their interests remain aligned. Otherwise, we would leave the playing field to more authoritarian regimes who, at a certain point, may determine the standards for technologies and economic policy making in general. And this is perhaps not a situation that we all welcome.
I saw a comment in the live, a question in the live comments. The question was about, it says, since California is such a large defining economy on its own, what do you think the role of the US should be in carving out new privacy laws? So I think that, it's actually extremely hilarious, a little bit ironic that, because some of you guys have already alluded to it, that the thing that we're trying to build borders around is the internet, right? Like the cloud, like the fact that all of our independent nations that used to, and still do, but used to, very closely work together on everything. Now it's like, I need to protect California citizens and I need to protect European citizens. But then even within the EU, Italy is like, I need to protect my citizens. So I'm only going to adhere to this part, of this law. We need, in my opinion, and this definitely comes from some very good reading, if you guys have ever come across it. It was written by an author, Anya Manuel. She's the director of the Aspen Strategy Group. And she says that all of the allied forces that are very progressive in technology in the world, we need to come together to start creating a standard of how we're going to address these things. Because this idea that we're mad at certain nation states, right? Like there's a lot of vitriol towards China, and whether you feel that's merited or not is, aside, but there is this, we need to, keep liberalness and the institutions that we've created alive, but we're not collaborating on the thing that is going to ensure a global power balance in between our economies. So, all the panelists have spoke about how GDPR has hindered innovation in the EU, how a lot of people are probably not going to give up their tech, their American tech to move to new companies. Well, why don't we all come together and start laying out a framework of what we believe, should happen. So, and we also, as I think, we should have the private sector involved in that conversation. Trying to go at it alone and individually is really, really silly, and it doesn't make sense. Just trying to regulate the internet in this fragmented way, trying to regulate privacy in this fragmented way, because if our long-term strategic goal is to think about economic competition, through 2030, 40, 50, everybody is more or less borderless, and all of our work is borderless too. So we need to make sure that there is some type of understanding so that all of our companies can thrive the way that we want them to. And I think that's what the US's role is that we need to get up out in front of this and say, hey guys, let's come together, let's do something, because us doing things individually is not it.
Hey, thanks. And I would like to thank all of our panelists for participating today. We're coming right up to time for the end of this discussion. Would you guys like to leave any closing thoughts? Minute from each person. Andreas, any closing thoughts?
Well, thanks, Katie. I think it's important that we do more panels like this about topics that involve all of us. We heard about the new European digital strategy, about new implementations for GDPR. So I think it's important just to like keep this exchange alive and submit our comments, and hope that those measures will not be as bad as we think they will.
Okay. Thanks. And Philip?
Thank you. I like a lot about what Alexiaa was saying about getting a more collaborative approach to these regulations. Just my question is from the last slide I had on the problem of distributed costs and concentrated benefits, is how do we get the right people in the room to organize, to take meaningful action, to make sure the internet remains democratized and less polarized. We need to do more about talking about those harms that probably people don't feel that are affecting them.
Thanks. Matthias, Eline, or Alexiaa, any closing thoughts? Sure.
Yeah, so I think many digital companies in the past have been a blessing to society, and I'm pretty confident that in the future there will be more digital companies that will be a blessing to society as well. At the same time, I see that many companies that pursue digitalized business models, including the largest digital players from the US, like Facebook, Amazon, or Google, they are charging way too much for their services. Prices are still relatively high compared to smaller companies that try to gain ground in these markets. And I think competition is the answer. And I think we, policymakers in general, will not revive competition in these markets by adding layers and layers of new regulation. And this needs to be taken into consideration for the future, so that prices go down and companies continue to provide us with services of good quality and reliability.
Great, thanks.
I'm happy to add a couple of things. So I agree with what was mentioned broadly. Don't want to get back to that, but it would be interesting to continue the discussion. I wanted to close by referring to this consultation, the GDPR. The Commission has opened until, I think it's on you said 29th of April, and we're submitting a consultation to that. And of course, so the EDPB, the European Data Protection Board, said before the crisis that major changes to the GDPR would come too early. Now there might be some changes and adjustments that have to be made because of COVID, but a review in June of the GDPR certainly doesn't mean a revision, but we are pointing to issues that we see in terms of the international data transfers, especially the review of some of the adequacy deals with third countries and the consistency and coordination mechanism with between data protection authorities, because we're seeing there are definitely things that could be improved. If you think of adequacy, for example, the EU has not applied to China the same standards it applies to the United States with regard to personal data, and that approach is an arbitrary nature in the approach. Now only 13 countries have adequacy. It's a long process, it's a lengthy process. Now it's even harder to achieve because of the GDPR's higher standards. So there are a few discussions like that are likely to be super important to contribute to. And I'm not even talking about the privacy shield, of course, that is being in jeopardy at the moment. And that means more legal uncertainty for the many companies using it. So I just wanted to refer to that very important year, I think, in data protection.
I definitely just want to say thank you guys. It has been a complete honor to join you all. And my last plea is twofold. Everybody, because we're all working from some of everywhere, and our homes are everywhere. When you go back to your respective places, I just plea, that we don't over politicize. It's too important and it's too transient. And second, I hope that if we all just keep with the attitude of respecting and supporting competition among tech, that this will make a partnership that will support all of our nations for years to come. So, thank you guys.
Great, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining today. Really appreciate you kind of running through this, especially just a couple of days ahead of the comment period. We'll be submitting comments as well, and I've included everybody's Twitter handles if you'd like to get in touch with any of the folks who spoke today about any of their research or any of their other things. I encourage you to follow and tweet at all of them. Again, thank you guys so much, and this will be up on YouTube if you would like to watch it again or share it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.